Hello and welcome again to the Friday Download. I'm Jordan Small, Executive Director here at the NZ Council. This is episode 13, Friday the 20th of March. So we're recording this episode in an empty office space in Wellington's central business district at a really strange time where the threat of COVID-19 is causing a lot of fear and worry. So my colleagues today are working from home, so we really are right in the middle of the office space and there's no one around. Normally this would be an office of 25, 30 people. So it is quite a strange feeling. But, the preparation needs to be done. So my colleagues are working from home today, testing out their various IT systems and making sure that they are up and running and ready to go when the time comes for them to be working at home. And that time will come. So today we'll take a quick look at current US political events, which really have been dominated by the COVID-19 response. We'll look at New Zealand's response to date briefly, and then talk to my guest today about the future of transport. So maybe let's introduce my guest. So she has held senior management roles in the public and private sectors, served as a consultant to boards and governments, advised prime ministers, ministers and leaders of international organisations. She is also on my board as country director for Wisk, leading a multinational team bringing the world's first self-flying electric air taxi to market. Anna Kominik, welcome.
Welcome, thank you.
Thank you for joining me in this rather strange environment at the moment.
Yes, it's very quiet, I have to say.
I can't think of a time like this.
No, it's quite a strange feeling to be sort of so remote from your colleagues as well. It's interesting. In Wisk, we are remote from our parent company, which is in California. They are in full lockdown at the moment because of the shelter in place that the Californian governor has put in place in California to control the spread of coronavirus there. And I know, we had an all-hands, a staff meeting last week. There was 400 people coming in from their homes all over California. So, you do lose that sense of connection with your colleagues. It's quite hard. It's quite isolating for people, and you have to work a lot harder on the communication between your team members and as a management team. It's quite different skills that we're learning in this time, and hopefully they'll continue to benefit us into the future. We won't forget them.
Yeah, I think that we will see a lot of changes, I think, coming out of this and the experience of it and, new ways of working. And I think we'll get into that conversation a little bit more around, supply systems and because this is massive, right? And just the impact on our lives, our business lives, everything is, it's quite strange.
Yeah, I don't think it's too emotive to say that things won't be the same again. And they weren't the same after the GFC. So we do, as a humanity, we learn from these experiences and we take something forward into the future with that. Hopefully it will be positive.
Yeah. I hope so. Because I'm not sure we always learn from crises, do we?
No. Yeah. There's some, the thing that I am most confident about is the sense of humanity that we as countries have kind of, there's a common sense of humanity around the fact that while we are managing this within our own borders, we are, very clear about the fact that it's affecting everybody around the globe, and we're learning from each other as we go. Unfortunately, some are, suffering more as a result of that. But it is an example of how collectively we can learn from each other and we can, follow a call to action. As you and I were talking about a little earlier, Jordan, imagine what we could do as globally around climate change if we took the same approach. These are things that actually hopefully we do take forward and deal with some of those really big issues that face us.
Clearly, we are not prepared, and Trump only exacerbates the crisis. When we spend twice as much per capita on healthcare as any other nation, one might expect that we would have enough doctors all over this country. One might expect that we would have affordable prescription drugs. One might expect that we are preparing effectively for a pandemic, that we were ready with the ventilators, with the ICUs, with the test kits that we need. We are not.
This is a crisis. This is like we are being attacked from abroad. This is something that is of great consequence. This is like a war. And in a war, you do whatever is needed to be done to take care of your people.
I want to just give a quick overview of the latest US political events, where those are at, and then we'll come into our main discussion. So looking at the primary events, really, it's not a competitive race anymore. The latest Democratic Party debate was not a game changer. Neither candidate was dominant. And, barring major illness, there is really no viable pathway forward for Sanders. In the context of COVID-19, the most responsible action for Sanders to take and his campaign team is to concede and end the race and allow for the party nominee to focus on responding to the crises and taking on Trump later in the year. The one interesting thing to come out of the debate was Biden's commitment to select a woman as his running mate. So no major candidate has ever done this or made such a pledge so early in the race and narrowed his field of potential vice presidential nominees. And I don't think he needed to do it. I don't think he needed to define his eventual choice of running mate in terms of gender. He could have started with competence, appeal, or even relative youth as better ways of framing up how he would choose a running mate. And he could have left it for others to say, well, that person also needs to be a female. But he's made that call now, and it is the right call. But I don't know. I don't think you want to be the person he selects and be perhaps framed as you've been chosen because you're a female first. But perhaps that's just a New Zealand perspective on that particular debate. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out over the next wee while. But really, it's all been about COVID-19. So, New Zealand's announcement yesterday of a $12.1 billion COVID-19 support package for New Zealand businesses. It includes a set of really very practical measures. Over $5 billion will be available for wage subsidies and a COVID-19 leave package or payment scheme. Will provide support for those people unable to work because they are in self-isolation, are sick with COVID-19 or caring for dependents. A further package is expected in a couple of months that will have more of a focus on larger businesses and helping those businesses through this time. Just by way of example, Air New Zealand have reduced their network capacity, 85% across international routes and 80% across trans-Tasman routes, with possible redundancies of 3,600 people. So that's massive there. We're also seeing public gatherings cancelled. We see, and I think it's quite likely, we'll see schools and daycares forced to close. So that, there's a lot happening there on that front. We've had a little bit of a chat already around what Wisk is doing in response to COVID-19 in California and here. What do you make of the response today?
Look, I think it's the responsible approach to take. I think, as I've said to our team, this is about risk mitigation, not risk elimination. We can't stop the spread, but what we want to do is flatten the curve and slow it up. And I think the interesting thing from our business perspective is that this is very much about the community and our families. That is the focus. Obviously, we want to be able to keep, doing our business and doing our work. But, really, from a company perspective, you took this from an individual perspective, your risk is probably quite low, and that your demographics, if you're in the younger demographic, then it's quite, likely that you'll get it, but it won't be serious. But really what we're looking at from a business perspective is saying we are part of this community and we need to take measures as well to actually slow the progress of it through the community, because that's good for everybody. Yeah. That's not always the way that we approach business. We sometimes are a little bit more focused on our own individual or company needs. In terms of the government approach, I think it was the right thing to do to limit people coming in, and the self-isolation requirements I think are really important. Had a big impact on us because we rely heavily on our American colleagues coming backwards and forwards, and us going backwards and forwards from California. So we've had to rethink exactly, everything in terms of how we approach our work, which is predominantly research and development and certification.
And so what is some of that rethinking involved, for example, around travel?
Yeah, so we're actually drawing even more heavily on local resources, which is good. We're actually having to upskill some local resource to actually help us with that, which is going to be in the long term good for New Zealand. We are having to look at ways that we can shift work from America to New Zealand, because our New Zealand team, we are testing in Tekapo. We have 2 aircraft down there. And so we're actually able to move some of the work that would have been happening in the US potentially to the New Zealand team. And how do we sort of upgrade the capability down there to get that done? So we don't lose momentum, because our manufacturing and our offices up there are in full closure. All of our colleagues are working from home. So they can't get in there to do the work that we can still do. So there's some positives out of this in terms of actually how we operate. I think it's just the collaboration that you actually have to start really getting into, and working out different ways of getting information across borders and working, remotely. Lots of Google Hangouts. Google's doing really well. Yeah. Zoom will be too.
Planning around this response, how long are you planning for?
Look, in terms of New Zealand, I think we're about 4 to 6 weeks behind the US. So in terms of that curve, and hopefully the curve will be sort of flattened as a result of everything that's going on. So we're really thinking through various scenarios at the moment, and I think all businesses should be doing that. But really we're looking at sort of June, July coming out, or starting to come out the end of it, probably earlier, hopefully, for the US. But, it would be a 4 to 5 month period of this kind of intensity. Yeah. And then there's going to be a sort of a tail of the effects of that intensity as people get back to normal.
Yeah. And what kind of impact does it have on projects and programs of work that I guess are still going at the moment?
Well, they're not going in the US quite to the same extent because of the shutdown, so that is a challenge. And as I say, having a New Zealand arm has been actually very beneficial, because you can actually start to shift some of the work to New Zealand, which is not in full shutdown yet. So we're taking full advantage of that. And certainly they're still working up there, but they're working from home. So there are some aspects that they can continue with and some aspects that are more difficult to continue with. We're just getting quite inventive as to how we're managing that. Yeah.
No. Just before we move on, the one other observation I've made around this is just how much easier it makes a response when you have a nationwide healthcare system, and you can make nationwide allocation decisions on resources, and the difficulties that the US has because of state by state, district by district, public private insurance players in there, all this sort of added complication that makes a coordinated nationwide response are more difficult. You saw, with China and Wuhan, their ability to contain it within Wuhan effectively. It got out a little, but because they have that sort of nationwide sort of layer, or province-wide layer, and we're able to effectively contain it there, and then kind of put resources into that containment zone. We don't have something similar in New Zealand. I'm not sure that we would want that kind of system, but we have. We do have a good sort of nationwide state healthcare system, which gives us some advantages, I think, with handling this sort of crises. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I look at the US. They have some significant challenges around, uninsured people in terms of their access to medical cover. Are those people going to actually go and do, with the co-payments that were there around the testing, that would have been a significant barrier to them actually accessing the testing. And we know from the World Health Organization that testing, it's testing, and Taiwan's actually contained, South Korea have done a very good job of testing a lot, and therefore helping to contain the spread of the virus. So I think that the number of illegal immigrants is a big issue for the states. They will not necessarily go and get healthcare when they need it, and I think that's those are the unknowns that sit in that community, and that will be very difficult to manage on top of all of the complexity of their healthcare system, full stop. In New Zealand, I don't think we can get away from the fact that any healthcare system, no matter how well developed, will be under strain as a result of this particular virus. And we don't want to be in a situation like Italy, where we're turning people away at the hospital door because we don't have capacity, which is why it's so important that we're all taking these measures as individuals and companies and communities to flatten that curve so that demand is slowed up so that our healthcare system can actually cope with it. I think the other thing that it really highlights is how vulnerable we are as a small country in the bottom of the world in terms of supply. And that is one of those ongoing issues that I think that we will grapple with over post all of this, as to how do you secure your supply, for pandemics, for crises. What are the things that are really important to us to sustain, and what supplies do we need to sustain to keep our own population safe and sustained?
Yeah, that's a really good point around supply. And, because we've had this movement, I don't know, last 30 years, perhaps longer, of, just-in-time supply. Not having a lot of extra capacity there, being able to manufacture on demand, essentially. Yep. And, that sort of thinking really being tested at this kind of time.
A reliance on being a demand-driven economy is something I think that we will probably look at in the future. And I would hope we would look at, because we are more vulnerable as a result of that. It's not to say that you suddenly swing the other way and stop full globalisation, because we've benefited hugely from globalisation. But I think it is about, how much we demand-driven, how much we supply-driven, and how do we actually balance that out a little bit more.
Yeah, and we might see, and we've already been seeing it, certainly probably the last couple of years, that decoupling, and this sort of separation of supply systems already. Perhaps this accelerates that, and you do see these quite separate, perhaps, supply systems, something that looks, US-led, something that's more Chinese-led. I don't know. That's some thinking out there at the moment. Maybe. Yeah. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. I think I don't have an answer for it, but I do think there will be a reconsideration of that. That's huge for China because China has been so much supply driven. How much are we going to rely continually on the equivalents of the AliExpresses and all the rest of it to secure our cheap goods? Versus, making sure we've got the medical supplies when we need, or the infrastructure, right down to, just things for building houses right now. What are the things that are actually slowing us up as a result of this pandemic, and what's important to us to keep as a supply in New Zealand?
Yeah. I think we'll end this conversation here. I think like all the conversations on this show, I always have to end them early, and they could go on and on and on for hours because they often touch on these really big issues that are important, and this one is what for me anyway is what does a crisis force you to rethink, and what are some of the the positive changes that you can get out of a crisis. And I think some of them are around what we've been talking about, supply, a rethink around supplies and security of supply and key issues. That perhaps separation of supply chains, or that decoupling, or at least this pandemic accelerating that trend, and then the whole thing around what this demonstrates is the ability to mobilize to fix something. And, we have these massive global issues, not just the pandemic stuff, but climate and energy and other areas that require a global solution. And, this demonstrates, well, we can work together. We can work together, yeah. But maybe that's just naive and too optimistic.
I hope not. I hope that we learn from this.
Yeah. In this part of the discussion, we take a closer look at the future of transport, electrification, the evolution of batteries, capability and skills, and Anna and Wisk's desire to support the growth of an ecosystem that is enduring and sustainable. What was also interesting is the unique position and competitive advantage of New Zealand in being able to bring it all together and actually decide the regulatory frameworks that will govern some of these new technologies globally. Where I want to start is by looking forward 10 years into the future, and then I'll bring us back to what you guys are doing. But if you look forward 10 years, what does the future of domestic transport look like?
Look, I think we can see that we are at the beginning of an evolution of transport towards electrification, both on land and in the skies. That's partly a response to, a growing need to think about the climate, but it's also just, the evolution of technology. The battery technology has developed so significantly over the past decade. Our ability to, develop autonomous vehicles has, just grown exponentially over the past decade. So we are in a different space, as a people, in terms of how we get ourselves from A to B. And in 10 years' time, I think we will see a kind of that evolution starting to really show itself in our day-to-day lives. We will have more electric vehicles on the ground of various types, and there'll be that creates quite a few changes in the way we manage energy, the way we actually purchase energy. The thing of having your home charger, how will that be wrapped up in your energy bill, and who manages that? Or will it be something that, for example, car you buy your car and you get the energy package with it. There'll be some real significant changes in the way that we perceive, that aspect. I think the other thing with that energy delivery is that you've got battery technology, and for most batteries, they will have a residual amount left in them even after they've stopped being useful for a car, or in our case an aircraft. And you can actually use that, like the Tesla power banks. It starts to become quite, a realistic option for actually decentralising power generation. Individuals can have their own, equivalent of a power bank running their house and feeding back into the grid, for example. Solar energy, wind energy, all of these alternative energies start to become sort of much more ubiquitous across your marketplace. So there's going to be quite a bit of disruption there. And within that 10 years, we will have these aircraft, electric aircraft, both for longer sort of routes, but also for those commuter routes. We can't build more roads globally. And so really the only place that we can go is 3D, up. And so for places where traffic is a really significant time waster. I think in America they lose about an hour and a half on average a day, if not more, just in terms of commuting. So those are significant productivity issues for communities, let alone sitting in traffic in a gas guzzler. So actually having these electric aircraft available as an option as part of that sort of evolution of transport.
Yeah. And is vehicle ownership still a big part
That's a really good point.
The equation in this sort of future in 10 years' time? Or is it your, what are they calling it?
Ride share.
Share and vehicle as a service or something.
Look, in the focus grouping that we have in that younger age group, obviously younger than me, but younger age group, then the perception of car ownership is not as great. They don't have the same connection with a particular car brand or, even with the ownership concept. They're very happy to have the ride share type or car share type access. So I think that is a significant change, is that we're becoming more collective in our use of transport options. You just see it with micro-mobility, right? With the, takeoff of scooters and, bikes and all sorts of different kind of micro-mobility, is that we are very happy to swap quite quickly into different forms of transport and sort of see that as an ecosystem. So I think that gives huge opportunities for different types of transport to actually evolve into this, into the market.
With the taxi, or the pilotless taxi, how does that, will there be a number of locations around a city where these taxis land and then take off, and how do you see that? Look,
the thing that I say to people, this is not going to be the Jetsons within 10 years, possibly even 20 years, because, really this is bringing a new technology into the ecosystem. We've got a lot of things to work out as a community as to how to operate that. Very much the way we see it is that there will be essentially, highways or railroads in the sky. There will be a particular sort of track that will be from an A to B point. You will get yourself to the A point, you'll be taken to the B point, and then you take micro-mobility or your ride share to your final destination. So it's not point to point, but it is a significant part of that journey. So, for example, it might be over water, because we know that, for example, bridges often create, a log jam in commuter traffic. You just have to have one accident on the Auckland Harbour Bridge and, you've got a 2-hour wait. So, if you can have an electric air taxi that's actually taking you from A to B over that water, it's going to be faster, and that's going to be a benefit to you. The other one is, from city to airport. That's another, it's sort of routes that are really useful to people and are actually going to make a significant difference to the amount of time that they take to get somewhere. So, as we say, it's less time getting there and more time being there. Yeah.
And you would see eventually at some point, the taxi you're working on at the moment is a 2-person.
It is.
And at some point it would be, a 4-person or a 6-person?
So it's in terms of the industry that is emerging around electric vehicles, and we're in electric vertical takeoff and landing, so we don't require a runway. So we're essentially like a helicopter taking off and landing, and then we fly on the wing. So it's actually got wings and it's got 12 lift fans on it. So it lifts up and then it flies on the wing. For a vehicle like that, there's a number of different versions of that globally. There's enough, and they are all sort of taking a slightly different approach. But the idea is that all of them are looking to be electric or hybrid. And it's really, at the moment, the strength of the batteries to actually lift the passengers and the aircraft that is inhibiting how big they are. So as that battery technology improves, these aircraft will get bigger, and we will actually see larger and larger aircraft. But it is really the start of the electric aviation evolution to the point where we will be taking these sorts of vehicles, from Auckland to Wellington ultimately sometime in the future.
Wow.
Yeah.
And if you think of where we are right now in Wellington, what do you think some of the other opportunities this development or this innovation will open up? For example, I think of towns and cities that all of a sudden will be accessible.
Absolutely.
Marlborough. And,
they'll be 20 minutes away.
Yeah, 20 minutes away.
Yeah.
So there's that. Are there other opportunities you think this sort of technology will open up?
Yeah, look, I think at the very beginning, a technology like this creates ecosystem opportunities. So you essentially have a pipeline of talent that you have to create. So, we have aircraft maintenance engineers, but they're not your standard aircraft maintenance engineers because they're working on an electric aircraft. That's a whole different capability. We have flight test engineers, but they are flight test engineers for an electric aircraft. That's a different capability. So you're actually developing a capability within your economy that is quite different and is transferable across electric cars and electric aircraft. There's transferable skills. So you're developing that capability, and in this industry it is growing extremely fast. There is a huge amount of investment going on in it. Car manufacturers, aircraft manufacturers, they're all piling into the industry trying to get a foothold. It's not going anywhere. It is something that is going to happen. The beauty of it from New Zealand's perspective is that we're actually at the forefront at the moment of this industry, partly because of the work that we're doing, but also because of some of the other companies that have come in off the back of our presence here. And they are doing everything from, we're passenger vehicle, but there's agricultural drones or agricultural aircraft, there's emergency, there's mapping. So you develop an ecosystem around these sorts of technologies that is there for with all of the associated kind of service providers, as Rocket Lab has, that actually start to create an industry with a whole lot of opportunities for an economy to become more in that high value skills-based economy rather than, our traditional economy around agrarian and primary production.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've heard you talk about a number of times, and I thought, yeah, that's fantastic, which is if Wisk was to uplift at some moment and
And disappear.
Disappear.
Yeah.
What would you leave behind?
Yeah.
And it's what you're talking about, which is this ecosystem of not just supporting companies, but companies that I guess have spun out of involvement with you and others, and just a thriving sort of ecosystem. It is what we're seeing all over New Zealand at the moment around some key entrepreneurs and companies. I mean, I've talked to Sean Edlin of Dotterel Technology recently, who came out of LanzaTech, rolled out of that, and then has had a couple of other startups since then, and his whole team there are ex-LanzaTech or very closely connected. And so you see that snowballing of the snowballing that happens, and I think it's quite exciting.
It is exciting, but I think it's also about ensuring. So one of the things that we've worked very hard on is, for example, we are testing in the South Island, and we have a very good partnership with Ngāi Tahu. Part of that partnership is around, really encouraging their young leaders and their young people to think about STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, math, as real options. And they have a group that comes to Mountain View, to Silicon Valley, where we're based, every year, and they come to our facility, and then they also connect with the team down in Tekapo. And that gives them a connection as to, this is happening in New Zealand, but this is also what you can create. And we know that, just exciting, if I can excite one or two of those kids to think, I could be, a Stanford PhD and do something extraordinary, or I could do something at home around this, then that would be fantastic. That will actually help New Zealand in the future. I mean, I've worked with a lot of innovative companies. I've worked with companies that have come to New Zealand to test. And one of my key goals throughout this has really been to embed some of the benefits in New Zealand. Because so many times we see companies come to New Zealand, invest, but it's like a hand in sand. When they disappear, there's nothing left. And so I really do believe that what we're doing at the moment in terms of the partnerships, the internships we've got going, the work we're doing with the universities to identify, local talent to actually train up and bring on board, but also the gap analysis of what we have to actually continue to work on to really make sure our young people are fully available to take advantage of these opportunities. Those are the sorts of things that will ensure that New Zealand is well placed to continue to take advantage of this, very, very valuable new industry that's being built up. And we have a competitive advantage in it that, who knew?
Yeah. Well, why don't you talk to us a bit about that competitive advantage? But actually, before you do, I think the point around exposing young people to this as, hey, here's an exciting option that you might not otherwise have known about, and it's not just it's STEM, but here's a specific example of the application of those skills, and it's important. It's important to the world and to our future transport and energy and climate demands. I was just kind of thinking of as a child, why did I go into law?
Why did you go into law?
Well, I didn't know any scientists or see that. So
as an option. And that's what we find is that, you can just to have exposure to the opportunities is often really helpful for kids just to think a little bit more broadly. Even if they just keep math as one of their subjects through to year 13, that opens up a whole lot of options for them in the future, because we know they are going to change careers several times in their lifetimes nowadays. So just to be able to give them that sense that these things are important because they give you a whole lot of options and a whole lot of really exciting options. It's amazing to watch those young ones really sort of connect with what is possible. And the other thing I am really, one of the things that we're working with Ngāi Tahu on is very much around understanding what our communities, and not just Ngāi Tahu, but communities in general, what are our communities going to want from this technology? We have this opportunity with the air. It is our last resource, largely untapped. And, one could argue that we haven't done, we've got some room for improvement around how we've managed the land and water resources. So this is a real opportunity to say, with the air resource, how are we going to manage that well? What do we as a community expect from that management? And what do we want to see and not want to see? Because I think that's a really important part of these new technologies.
Yeah. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that? You talk about airspace as, an untapped resource and a competitive advantage.
It is.
Could you maybe explain that a little bit about, what are you talking about there?
Sure. So a couple of things. The reason that New Zealand has a competitive advantage in this particular, in the sort of the eVTOL industry, or in this new sort of aviation, electric aviation and autonomous vehicle aircraft area, is that we have some specific regulations that allow for testing in New Zealand. Everything in New Zealand is, as stringent and as safe as anywhere, in the world, and we have very, very strict regulations. Our CAA has been doing a really good job about making sure that we are safe, I know. So there is a particular competitive advantage, though, that we have around some progressive rule parts that allow for experimental aircraft like ours to test safely, and we have to follow huge numbers of rules, and it's very, very stringent, but it is there in a way that it isn't in other jurisdictions. So when our company actually was looking for a place to come, because they knew that that they weren't going to necessarily be able to do it in the US, they looked at a whole matrix of innovation elements that they were looking for, and they went round about 7 or 8 jurisdictions, and that matrix had everything from IP law to ease of doing business to the credible civil aviation authority, the ability to actually talk through a certification process for a completely new vehicle that nobody's ever seen before, and having a marketplace that is you can learn from. It's a Western economy that is, a lot of the learnings are transferable and scalable. So when they did that, and they did that global search, they came up with New Zealand being the top of the pile. And that's why they came to New Zealand and they established the company here. That competitive advantage has increased because we have a thing called the Innovative Partnerships Program in MB, and that is an opportunity to take a whole-of-government approach to these projects and these big issues, which basically means that we talk to the government with all of the agencies pretty much in the room to say, hey, look, this is what we're trying to do, this is the social engagement side, this is the certification side, and this is the airspace side, and how are we going to figure out this very difficult 3D puzzle to actually get to an end result that we can all be proud of, and that is safe, primarily safe, and that it is successful for everybody. And the social engagement I've talked a little bit about with, working with community, working with business, working with Ngāi Tahu, ensuring that we have those good partnerships with local government and central government. The certification, we're working with civil aviation, and that's a long, slow process of verification, flying, lots of hours, just flying and proving that, that the plane does what it says, that what we say it's going to do. And then the other part of it is airspace integration, and the government has been very progressive in thinking about how do we sort of incorporate these different technologies that are being developed, whether it be agricultural drones or mapping or, how do we actually manage our airspace well? And they're taking a phased approach to that. It's considered, it's deliberative, and it actually creates the data that globally we need to understand how we're going to manage that resource well. So last year, the government announced the airspace integration trials. That is an opportunity to test in a very structured way particular technologies in New Zealand in a safe way that allows the community and the government and the industry to work together to work out how can these particular platforms, is what we call them, be integrated into airspace.
Are we moving fast enough as a country, or are we moving as fast as we possibly can?
I think we're moving as fast as we possibly can, and I think New Zealand is right at the forefront of it. And the other jurisdictions are collaborative with New Zealand about what we're doing in this space. The FAA is very interested. We had we've been in discussions with the UK CAA. They are watching with great interest as to what's happening in New Zealand. They see the approach as something that they would love to do, but they can't because they're in much more complex environments. So, in a way, it's not that New Zealanders are guinea pigs in any way whatsoever. It's just we have this competitive advantage to actually determine what this industry looks like globally, and that's pretty exciting.
It is really exciting, and from a council perspective also, your company and what you're doing, not only is very important, but you're working across multiple areas of interest to the council. Future of work. So we talked a lot about capability and skill development. Very much in the our interest in trade, in terms of the future, what we call it, the future of trade, or new trade narrative, which is around digital trade and innovation, that kind of thing. And then of course data, which is how do you govern this massive hoovering up of data, and that's your vehicles have, I don't know how many sensors they'll have on them, but there'll be quite a number, plus visual. You got to be looking out and seeing where you're flying, so you're collecting a lot of information into there. I know you've had an interest in the 5G area, and where is that at?
Look, I think from our perspective, we are obviously in the situation we're autonomous, so we don't have a pilot on board, so sensors are going to be a significant part of how we operate, but as is likely, having particular radar or air traffic control support as well. So that's why we talk about corridors. The corridors in the sky, is it actually creates a safe space for us to operate. A lot of the technology that goes into those sensors, whether it be autonomous cars or autonomous aircraft, is still being developed and is still in the process of being certified. And so, those are things that still have to be developed and certified over time. I guess from the data perspective, we are very clear about the need for security of data and data transfer, regardless of what it is. And a little bit like knowing what you want out of that airspace resource and how you want to manage that. We are very strong advocates for New Zealand and other communities having a very clear sense of how we want to manage our data and what gets shared and what doesn't get shared, and having very clear expectations around that, and really encouraging New Zealand to actually have a very active conversation about that, because as you say, at the moment there are a lot of different resources that are picking up that data and using it in all sorts of different ways. Some of it we know about and some of it we don't.
I think we need to wrap it up there. We've gone long over time, but it's been a really, I think, fascinating discussion starting out with COVID and just, that discussion around what are going to be the ongoing impacts of that, and particularly around security of supply chains. I think that was a part of that discussion that I think was really, really interesting. And then into really the future of transport, where what you're working on fits into a sort of an integrated system of different transport modes. And it's just such a exciting, I think, and interesting area, and it can't come soon enough, I think, to address. We've so focused on building more roads, and I like driving my car on the road, but if that's going to be redundant, 10 or 15 years, and we've spent $6 billion, whatever it is, on building this new highway, that's just silly. But anyway,
Yeah.
thanks. So thanks, Anna, for joining me. You can find Anna's bio details in the episode notes. Thanks also to Michael Jeffrey, NZUS Council intern who researches and promotes the podcast each week. Your thoughts on the show are always welcome. My contact details can be found in the episode notes. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. So that's another episode down, a quickish download for your weekend listening. I'm Jordan Small. Join me next week for the Friday Download.